What does it mean to be a friend to someone? What is probably the best quality of a true friendship? In my estimation, it would be the ability to talk to and to have trust in that person. A small boy once defined a friend as this: someone who knows all about you and likes you just the same. Right? Knows our secrets, knows our desires, knows our shortcomings, knows our strengths, and yet still likes us. If you or I were going to have a great friendship with someone, we would need to spend time getting to know them, wouldn't we? I mean, that's one of just the definitions of it. We have to be together. On a human level, this involves talking and being around that person enough to know how they think, begin to know at least, how they react to situations, what they find important, what they deal with on a daily basis, and how that affects them, and probably most importantly, and perhaps is the deal breaker, how they feel about you. We understand this, and maybe even do this with friendships all the time. Some people we meet, we get to know, but we don't connect with them. We can have a casual relationship, doesn't mean we don't like them. There's just not much there that binds us together. With some people, we do find things in common, but maybe not enough for a deep friendship. We have a hobby in common with some interest. Maybe we went to school, the same place, but beyond that, there's not much. Most of us, though, have friends that we really connect with in a special way. Someone whom we trust, we're able to share our life with. A British publication once offered a prize for the best definition of a friend, and among the thousands of answers they received, here are just a couple. One who multiplies joys, divides grief, and whose honesty is inviolable. Another one said, one who understands our silence. There's the introverts for you. Another one said, a watch that beats true for all time and never runs down. Some of those friendships you can have, they can be very close-knit, and maybe over time and just the circumstances of life, you're not together as much, but when you get back together, it's like you never missed a beat. You pick right up where you left off. Here was the winning definition. A friend is one who comes in when the whole world has gone out. When things are not so well, or when we're dealing with hard things in life, that person is there. And as much as physical friendships are important to us, each and every Christian can and should have a very deep and personal relationship, a friendship, if you will, with God. And that can be hard to grasp in our modern world. It has so many doubts. We heard about some of that briefly in the sermonette. I read about it all the time, hear it in videos and whatnot, discussions, various podcasts where people have so many doubts about the things of God, whether he even exists. And if he does, why doesn't he do other things? Whatever it is they think he should do. But having that relationship, that friendship with God is a necessity for our spiritual growth. We're here on a Sabbath day. More important to consider, though, than our physical friends is what type of friendship we have with God, the Father of all, Jesus Christ, and the two of them together. It's easy for us to think of God in terms of correcting or chastising, especially in light of trials or difficulties we go through. We're mindful when he doesn't answer prayers the way we think that he should or as quickly as we think that he should. But what about his comforting characteristics? Do we think of God in terms of a great friend? When was the last time you or I stopped to consider that God considers us to be one of his friends? It's not a term he throws around a lot, but we'll look at some of that today. We're going to talk about approaching God as a friend, and in doing so, give one point to help develop your friendship with God. So I just briefly talked about how we develop a friendship on a human level, but how do we, being physical, have and develop a friendship with God who is spiritual? We can't see him in the normal sense of the word, do we? Talk to him directly like we would a physical friend, but let's go to Amos chapter 3, verse 3. God has always desired a relationship, and for those that truly understand his way of life and what he values and what he wants us to become, he does desire this friendship that I'm talking about here today. Even with Israel, as often as they disregarded his instruction, ignored the prophets, and just flat out violated his law, he still desired to have that relationship with them. And here in Amos, he's talking about that. He has sent Amos to give them a message of what they're missing, what's going to happen when they fail to follow through on this over time. And so in Amos 3:3, he asks, I read this as a rhetorical question, can two walk together unless they are agreed? To me, it's rhetorical because the obvious answer is no. If you have somebody that you have constant disagreements at work, do you make sure you go by their cubicle or their desk and make sure how they're doing? We tend to avoid those people, don't we? If you read the earlier verses here in this chapter, he's talking about this relationship, how he had only known them as a nation. He only desired to work with them. And he makes the statement in verse 3, can two walk together? Because they weren't at that time. So let's personalize this. Can we walk with God if we're not of the same mindset, if we're not agreed? To me, the answer is no. But let's look at James 2 in matters of friendship that we're talking about here today. James 2 and in verse 23, we have a very interesting statement here, and it's almost a unique statement in Scripture. Because what God says here about Abraham, he doesn't say about too many people. In James 2 and verse 23, he simply says this, the Scripture was fulfilled which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. This was not just when he took Isaac to the mount. This was when he left Ur. This is when he followed all the other instruction that God gave him. God knew that when he told Abraham something that he would go do it. And it says it was accounted to him for righteousness. But notice the very ending of this verse. And he, Abraham, was called the friend of God. He had that kind of intimate, personal relationship with God. Because it is not spoken of much in terms of other people being a friend of God, doesn't mean that they weren't, doesn't mean that we can't be a friend of God. Let's look at John 10. I'm leading up to something here, so give me a while to make my case and see if you agree with me here in a moment. John 10, verse 30. Christ here speaking, and he simply says, I and my Father are one. Now we could go to Deuteronomy 6 and talk about what that oneness is pictured in the Old Testament, but we could also turn to John 17 and look at what that oneness is talking about. He had as close a relationship with the Father as you could possibly have, doesn't he? They were the same, not only mindset, but they had the same goals, the same desires, the same will, the same characteristics. They were as unified as two beings can be. And when you read John 17, if you were to read that, you would see that that is exactly what Christ is asking for us to have with him and the Father. So in just looking at these few verses that we've rehearsed here briefly, I think that it's very reasonable for us to say that we can have a friendship with God in every sense of the word. That he's not this distant, disconnected individual being we go to in prayer, but we really have nothing in common with. That he's so far above us. Why does he listen to our prayers? We're not simply servants doing the bidding of a master. We're not robots being programmed to respond to command. We're called to be the friends of God. You can write in your notes, we're not going to turn there, but Exodus 34 in verses 6 and 7, it talks about the attributes of God. I would encourage you to go read that sometime this next week and just consider those attributes and how that would be a friend, how those would contribute to God being a friend to you and you to God. Well, let's go to Hebrews 5 next and look at the relationship that Christ had with the Father. Was there anything between the two of them before they created the universe, even after they created mankind, before the one who became the Son came in flesh and died for our sins? Was there anything that they withheld from each other? Was there anything that they didn't know? There's a little bit of a trick question in there. We see in Hebrews 5:8, one of the really interesting capacities that God has is that he can still learn. In Hebrews 5:8, we simply read here that though he was a son, speaking of Christ, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. Did he not have obedience to the Father before this? He did. What it means here is he had a deeper appreciation for this, especially for us. Now, God created us limited, physical, carnal beings, didn't he? Did he not know what he was creating? I speak as a fool. He absolutely knew what he was creating. That's why he made that owner's manual for us. So he doesn't look at us when we fail to live up to it as if we're worthless. Rather, he gives us his word so that we know what to change. He wants the relationship to not just continue, but to flourish. And even Christ learned these things. So we have an elder brother that we can go to as well. And we're to be imitators of him, aren't we? We're to be imitators of Christ. That's why we're called Christian. Followers, disciples, students of him. But this imitation of Christ extends not only to our obedience, our emulation of submission to the Father, but also to our relationship with God as Christ has. We read John 10:30. I and my Father are one. Let's go to 1 Peter next, not too far from where we are. 1 Peter 3 and verse 12. For the eyes of the eternal are upon the righteous, because God delights when we follow his instruction, not simply because we've obeyed. More to the point, because in our obedience we become like him. We value who and what he is. And God not only appreciates that, he enjoys that. His ears are open to their prayers. Do you believe that statement? That God hears your prayers? Or is it just so much rote exercise or an obligation? The face of the eternal is against those who do evil. God hears the prayers of the righteousness. And it's been said that the greatest union of minds is when two people agree. Can we have that kind of union? And if so, how do we have that kind of union? Well, I believe we can have that kind of union. So the answer on my end is yes. But how do we have that? I mentioned in my introduction about relationships and how we have to invest in them. Talking, being around that person, beginning to know how they think, how they react to situations, what they find important, what they value, and whether you are in agreement with that. One of the primary ways that you and I can implement a friendship with God in that spiritual relationship that we're to have, to become a friend of him, is through prayer. In prayer, we have the opportunity to have a dialogue of sorts with God. We don't think of it a dialogue because it tends to feel one-sided, doesn't it? But we're going to go into some things here in a moment that show that it doesn't have to feel that way. We get to tell him what we think, how we feel while we're struggling. We get to tell him our deepest shortcomings. He's not put off by any of that. What makes us happy? And then we see God act in our life in response to our prayers. This is from a quote from E. Stanley Jones in a book that he wrote entitled Liberating Ministry from the Success Syndrome. He says, prayer is a surrender to the will of God and cooperation of that will, with that will. If I throw out a boat hook from the boat and catch a hold of the shore and pull, do I pull the shore to me or do I pull myself to the shore? Prayer is not pulling God to my will, but the aligning of my will to the will of God. The core of who we are establishes the friendship, doesn't it? But in considering this relationship with God, this friendship with God, it's more importantly the core of who He is, isn't it? And that we're aligning ourselves. We're not pulling Him to us, we're pulling ourselves to Him. And I find it interesting, one of the very first things the disciples asked Christ to do is to teach them how to pray. And let's just look at that model prayer in Matthew 6. Did they not know how to pray? They had the temple. Prayer was a regular part of this. The Pharisees, as much as we know now that God condemned what they did publicly, the disciples nonetheless had that example of prayer before them all the time. So let's just read through this. Matthew 6 and verse 5 we begin. It says, "When you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues on the corners of the streets, and that they may be seen by men. And surely I say to you, they have their reward." And the reward was they were seen. They didn't have a relationship. He says, "But you, when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly." To show God that this is a very personal relationship. Verse 7, "And when you pray, don't use vain repetitions, as the heathen do, for they think that they will be heard through their many words." Now, this is not to say that we can't have the same conversation with God. Maybe over a period of time when something very deep is troubling us. This is talking about prepared, scripted prayers. Why would God listen to that? It gets annoying, doesn't it? Even, you have a little child and he's asking the same question over and over and over again. We know that they're learning, but it does get kind of annoying, doesn't it? Verse 8, "Therefore, don't be like them, for your Father knows the things you have need of before you ask Him." So why do we pray if He already knows? God wants to know if we're going to ask, and how we're going to ask, and what we're thinking about in asking, all these nuances. So in verse 9, he says, "So pray in this manner, our Father in heaven." What do we see there initially? That we begin our prayers in acknowledging God in all that He does and all that He is. Hallowed be your name. Do we do that? Do we approach Him in the holiness that He has? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, because His will is not always our will, is it? God, I'm behind on the bills, so help me win the Powerball this week. There's a whole lot of trouble that'll come with that money. Is that the best answer to that prayer? What is God's will? We can struggle in knowing that. I've had that conversation repeatedly for a number of years with God. I don't understand, and you don't owe me an answer, but I need to know at least that I'm doing the right thing, going the right direction. Verse 11, "Give us this day our daily bread." Asking what we need, not what we want, what we need. And it can be especially hard for us in this country, but in the Western nations in general, because we really don't need much more than we already have, do we? You look at what we're blessed with, and food and clean water, opportunity to move around, all the electronics that we have, the cars that we can buy, just everything. We live so much higher than the rest of the world. And we can forget that. I don't have the right car. I don't have enough clothes. I don't have whatever. That we understand that God will provide what we need, what we truly need. Forgive us our debts, to ask for forgiveness. One of the secrets of friendship is being able to say, "I'm sorry." That's actually a secret to any relationship. To go to God and say, "I know, it pains me. I wish I could do better, but I'm sorry, I messed up again." But then, as God forgives us, we are to forgive those who have done us wrong, our debtors. That's a hard one humanly. And let me just ask, I'm not looking for a show of hands, when was the last time you prayed for somebody that you would consider an enemy? That's what that's talking about. That's now, as you cease to preach and you start to meddle. Right? That gets hard. We don't want to hear that. Verse 13, don't lead us into temptation. We have to do our part, not to be around temptation, but not to let that impact us the way it does the rest of the world. Deliver us from the evil one, for yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. This is just an overview of things, principles, if you will, to keep in mind as we talk to God in prayer. But an effective prayer also involves the right approach and focus. Let's look across the page, chapter 7, verse 7. Matthew 7, verse 7. Ask, and it will be given to you. Again, this is not the Powerball. This is not, things that the world pursues. He says, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open to you. Now, what is the right focus? How do we know what to ask for? Well, look back at the end of chapter 6 and verse 33. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Are we asking for the things God wants us to have to be in his kingdom? Cars are not going to get us there. Houses, jobs are not going to get us there. Money, anything else the world pursues, that's not going to get us there. Help me to understand the trials I'm going through. What do I need to learn from this so I can be in your kingdom? Why is this health issue not being resolved? What should I learn from this? Why do I have such great difficulty in this relationship, whether it's marriage or jobs or in families or whatever? What am I not catching? What am I not doing? What am I not seeing? This is what he's asking about here in verse 7 of Matthew 7. Ask about those things. Seek them. And he says, you will find them. Knock and it will be open to you. True Christian prayer is deeper than those superficial things. Again, back to the model prayer, God knows what our needs are. We can still ask for those things. But it's more than the physical things. If we get stuck there, it's a very shallow relationship and friendship, isn't it? Because true prayer, again, is about seeking above anything else God's will. Let's go to Proverbs 3. With that in mind, let's look at something Solomon wrote that ties, I believe, very deeply into this. Proverbs 3 and verse 5, he writes here, trust in the eternal with all your heart. Remember what I said about friendship? Connected friendship revolves around trust. And again, not asking for a show of hands, but have you ever had a friendship broken because trust was broken? I have. And the really hard thing is that the other person doesn't understand what it's going to take to rebuild that friendship, if it can be rebuilt. Because once you break trust, where do you go? What do you have? So don't trust in your own understanding. Trust in the eternal with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Now, how do we acknowledge him in all of our ways? This is just my viewpoint for what it's worth. Anything good that happens in life, I give God credit. Because he's the one that put it all in place to begin with. In one way or another, it all comes from him. The food we have, the physical things we have, the health we have, the life we have, whatever we have. So when it all goes good, I thank God. I thank him when I get home and I haven't had an accident, because there are an awful lot of stupid people on the road. I'm praying that AI technology gets good enough that we don't have any drivers anymore. We'll see. Verse 7, do not be wise in your own eyes, fear the eternal, and depart from evil. We can go to God and we can say, look, I don't know. I've done this before. God, I don't have a clue what I should do here. Ask him to direct your steps. He can close doors. He can open doors. He can make it clear. And if we're doing it for the right reasons, you have a job opportunity. I don't know. I've done my diligent search. This company seems good. The interview went well. All the benefits, the pay seems reasonable, but am I stepping into something that's going to be worse than what I have? And not just because I need to have something nice, but to take care of family, to be able to provide in that way, to be part of God's work and tithes and offerings, and being able to serve in other ways. That's not an unreasonable thing to ask for. But let's consider an example now. With all that we've covered at this point, this background, let's take a look at one example. If you'll turn to 2 Kings 18. An example of how we can approach God as a friend in our prayers, and in doing so, develop a much deeper friendship with Him. 2 Kings 18 is the story of Hezekiah. And they were facing, as a nation, a very hard time here, Judah, because the Babylonian Empire was pushing down. They'd already taken captive many of the surrounding nations, and they were, in many ways, a very brutal military power. So 2 Kings 18, we'll just read a section here at the beginning of this, starting in verse 1. It came to pass in the 3rd year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king. Now, I'm not disparaging anybody, but those of you that are older than 25, think back to when you were 25. What did you know? You thought you had the world in your hand, didn't you? You get to be 20, 30, 40 years or whatever older, and you realize you didn't know anything at 25. It's just the way we are. We're still learning and growing. Here he is, 25 years old. He's now king of the nation. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. And I just find that interesting because God doesn't always name the mothers. She must have been very special. Verse 3, he did what was right in the sight of the Eternal. And that was a rare thing to say for any of the kings of Israel or Judah. He was on the right path. He had the right understanding, the right approach before God. It says, according to all that his father David had done. We know about David's heart. Verse 4, he removed the high places. He broke the sacred pillars. He cut down the wooden images and broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. All of these idols that had filled the land. And if you go back and read the account, the bronze serpent was made for what? Israel had sinned, and God had sent the snakes in to punish them. And they pleaded with Moses to ask God to stop. And so God told them to make this serpent image. When they looked on it, then they would be healed. It became an idol piece. They forgot about God behind it. So Hezekiah even had to destroy that. He said, because until those days, the children of Israel burned incense to it and called it Nehushtan. They made it a god. They weren't connected to God. They didn't have the right friendship, even let alone a relationship. So verse 5, again about Hezekiah, he trusted in the eternal God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among the kings of Judah. That's a statement, isn't it? For he held fast to the eternal. He wanted to stay close to God. He clung to that friendship. It was important to him. It's not a casual thing because he had too many examples of kings who just decided, I can do whatever I want. I'm king. Verse 6, he held fast to the eternal. He did not depart from following them, but kept his, God's, commandments, which the eternal had commanded Moses. The eternal was with him because of these things. So you and I don't have a quid pro quo relationship with God. If I do X, I show up on Sabbath, I show up on holy days, I tithe, I do whatever, then God has to do other things. That's not the relationship we have. That's not a friendship. That's a business deal. To have a relationship, there's more, isn't it? I do something kind just because I want to. I remember their birthday, I remember an anniversary, I remember something. Just in passing, they mention something they'd like to have, and I go get it for them with no expectation. And then they do the same thing back or more. You're wanting to lift the other person up, give them the benefit of something that you have or you can do. That's what he's talking about here. The Lord was with him. He prospered wherever he went. Again, in part because of the relationship, but also because it was founded on the right things. You know, you and I can follow God's law long enough that we can forget the benefits that it brings if we're not careful. The blessings that just automatically flow because we are obeying what God is saying. Hezekiah had that kind of relationship. And so then it says here at the end of verse 7, and he, Hezekiah, rebelled against the king of Assyria, did not serve him. I'm sorry, I said Babylon earlier. He subdued the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory, and from the watchtower to the fortified city, and it came to pass in the 4th year of King Hezekiah, so he's now 29 years old, which was the 7th year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. So they're pressing down. They're taking captive peoples and nations. And at the end of 3 years, they took it. They captured Samaria. And in the 6th year of Hezekiah, that is the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel, Samaria was taken. The king of Assyria carried Israel away captive to Assyria and put them in Halah by the Habar, the river Gozan, in the cities of the Medes. Notice why. This is why God allowed them to be taken captive, because they did not obey the voice of the eternal their God, but transgressed his covenant and all that Moses, the servant of the eternal, had commanded, and they would neither hear nor do them. It was a consequence of their own actions, or lack thereof. By contrast, we see Hezekiah trusted in God, clung to God, kept God's commandments, witnessed the destruction and the captivity of the northern 10 tribes, the nation of Israel. And so 8 years later, Hezekiah comes face to face with the Assyrian forces himself. But consider all of this in terms of Hezekiah being a friend of God. So let's pick up the story in verse 13. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. Then Hezekiah of Judah sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Turn away from me. Whatever you impose upon me, I will pay. He thought this was an opportunity to get out from underneath the yoke of the Assyrians. And the Assyrians came down and did great damage in the nation. He basically went back and said, I'm sorry. The king of Assyria assessed Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold. Huge tribute payment. Okay, I'll stop, but this is what you got to pay. Verse 15, so Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Eternal and the treasuries of the king's house. He pays tribute. Takes the only wealth he has as a nation. He stripped, verse 16, stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Eternal, from the pillars which Hezekiah the king of Judah had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Syria. Verse 17, then the king of Assyria sent to Tartan the Rabsaris and the Rabshakeh from Lachish with a great army against Jerusalem to King Hezekiah. And they went up and came to Jerusalem, and when they had come up, they went and stood by the aqueduct from the upper pool, which was on the highway to Fuller's Field. It wasn't enough. What's he going to do now? This story unfolds. Well, verse 18, when they had called the king, Eliakim the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, Shabna the scribe, Joah the son of Asaph, the recorder, came out to them. He goes out to the Rabshakeh. Basically, it's terms of surrender, conditions. In the Rabshakeh, there's discussion in various commentaries, historians. The Rabshakeh is probably not the name of the person. It's probably the office. He is the representative of the king of Assyria. So the Rabshakeh says to them, say now to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, what confidence is this in which you trust? You speak of having plans and power for war, and they are mere words. In whom do you trust that you rebel against me? So he's speaking for the king here. By all accounts, when you look at history, the Rabshakeh had every justification to say this, didn't he? What nation was able to stand against them? So verse 21, now look, you're trusting in the staff of this broken reed Egypt. They had made alliances earlier. And when push came to shove, Egypt wasn't any help. God told them that. Don't go after these alliances. He says, on which if a man leans this broken reed, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who trust him. But if you say to me, we trust in the Eternal. See, they knew enough about Judah. If you say it's your God you trust in, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away and said to Judah and Jerusalem, he shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? And he mixed it up, though, didn't he? He confused taking away those altars as purifying the nation with taking away where they would worship their gods. So verse 23, now therefore I urge you, give a pledge to my master, the king of Assyria, and I will give you 2,000 horses. And this is a dig here. This is a snide comment. If you are able on your part to even put riders on them. I'll make you part of the empire. I'll give you horses for military reasons. I doubt you could even put men on them. He's very snide and cheeky here, isn't he? Verse 24, how then will you repel one captain of the least of my master's servants? You don't have any power. You put your trust in Egypt for the chariots and horsemen, and now I have come up without the Eternal against the place to destroy it? He's saying, I'm confused here. He's playing with words. I'm confused. This God you trust in, where is he? What has he done? You don't even have men to mount an army. So then verse 26, Eliakim the son of Hilkiah, Shebna, and Joah said to the Rabshakeh, please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Do not speak in Hebrew in the hearing of the word who are of the people on the wall. They didn't want the people becoming discouraged because a lot of what he was saying was true. They were fearful the people would be disheartened, I guess is the best word I could put with it. But the Rabshakeh says to them, has my master sent me to your master and to you to speak these words, not to the men who sit on the wall, who eat and drink their own waste with you? They've got skin in this game. They need to hear this. So then verse 28, then the Rabshakeh stood and called out with a loud voice in Hebrew. He wanted everybody to hear this and spoke, saying, hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you from this hand, nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Eternal, saying, the Eternal will surely deliver us. This city shall not be given to the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Israel, make peace with me by a present and come out to me, and every one of you eat from his own vine, every one from his own fig tree, every one of you drink the waters of his own cistern. If you listen to Hezekiah, he's going to lead you to death. I will let you live and keep all you have. It's a pretty powerful thing, isn't it? Verse 32, until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards. You'll have everything you have, but it's going to be in a different country. Verse 33, has any of the gods of the nations that all delivered its land from the hand of the king of Assyria? And up until this point, the answer was no. No, they hadn't. Where are the gods of Hamath, Arphad? Where are the gods of Seraphim and Hannah, Eva? Have they delivered Samaria from my hand? Who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their countries from my hand, that the Eternal should deliver Jerusalem from my hand? What is the best predictor of future behavior? Past behavior. He's got a point, doesn't he? It could be very disheartening. What do you do when an employer says, you know what, if you don't work past sundown this week to get this contract out, don't bother coming in on Monday? Some of you have faced that. What if you're blindsided by some illness? Doesn't look like there's any hope of surviving physically. Bad news on your doorstep. Doesn't hurt without being deep, does it? This is very similar. We're fighting different battles, but it's still the same battle, isn't it? Verse 36, I find this very interesting. I have to wonder how much influence, I'm sort of saying that tongue-in-cheek, that Hezekiah had. It said, the people held their peace and answered him not a word, for the king's command was, don't answer him. They respected Hezekiah. They listened to what he had to say. So then verse 37, Eliakim the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, Shebna the scribe, Joah the son of Asaph, the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn and told him the words of the Rabshakeh. What would you do in this situation? And we probably know the end of the story, though, don't we? But would you do the same thing Hezekiah did? Verse 1, chapter 19, and so it was when King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes, he covered himself in sackcloth. These are outward expressions of humility, of grief. Notice what he did next. He went into the house of the Eternal. Hezekiah is saying in his actions, I don't have an answer for any of this. I'm going to go place this before God. Then he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, Shebna the scribe, the elders and the priests, covered in sackcloth, to Isaiah the prophet, to the son of Amos. And they said to him, thus says Hezekiah, this day is a day of trouble and rebuke and blasphemy, for the children have come to birth, but there is no strength to bring them forth. And it may be that the eternal your God will hear all the words of the Rabshakeh, whom his master the king of Assyria has sent to reproach the living God, and will rebuke the words which the eternal your God has heard. Therefore, lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left. Hezekiah is soliciting others to do the same thing that he is doing. So the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, and Isaiah said to them, thus shall you say to your master, thus says the Eternal, do not be afraid of the words which you have heard, which the servants, the king of Assyria, have blasphemed. Surely I will send a spirit upon him, and he shall hear the rumor and return to his own land, and will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. Just a truly astounding thing to consider, isn't it? God's essentially telling Hezekiah, don't worry, you're not even going to have to lift a finger. Would the answer have been the same if Hezekiah had not approached God that way? I doubt it. He'll fall by the sword in his own land. Verse 8, then the Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria warring against Libnah. Bo and behold, things have changed back home, haven't they? The king heard concerning Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, look, he has come out to make war with you. And so he again sent messengers to Hezekiah, saying, thus shall you speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah, saying, do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you, saying, Jerusalem shall not be given into the hand of the king of Syria. There's a lot of chutzpah here, isn't there? As he's having to leave to go take care of another matter, he's saying, and don't forget, your God's not going to deliver you. Look, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the lands by utterly destroying them, and you shall be delivered? Again, he repeats this threat. Have the gods of the nations delivered those whom my father have destroyed? Gozan, Haran, Reseph, the people of Eden. Where's the king of Hamath? He goes down this list again. But here's where it gets really interesting to me. In spite of the Rabshakeh's repeated beratings and threats, verse 14, Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers. What the Rabshakeh had wrote, the clear instructions if he was to submit to the king of Assyria. Hezekiah received that letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And notice what he did. Hezekiah went up to the house of the Eternal and he spread it before the Lord. Did God not know what was in those letters? He certainly did. This is how a friend approaches another friend. Have you read this? And he lays it before God and he says, I don't know what to do with this. Hezekiah prayed before the Eternal and said, O eternal God of Israel, the one who dwells between the cherubim, you are God, you alone, above all the kingdom of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear. This is not a demand. This is a conversation between two friends. Please, incline your ear, O Eternal, and hear. Open your eyes, O Eternal, and see, and hear the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to the reproach of the living God. I can't do anything about this, but he is being beyond disrespectful, arrogant. Verse 17, truly, eternal, the kings of Assyria have laid waste the nations in their lands. He's saying what he's threatening me with is exactly what's happened. I have nothing against what he has said, nor can I stop anything that he's threatened me with. And have cast their gods into the fire, for they were not gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they destroyed them. Now therefore, O eternal our God, I pray, save us from this hand, his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you are the eternal your God, the God, you alone. That's a very powerful prayer, isn't it? An acknowledgement of what he couldn't do, and an acknowledgement of the trust that he had. This is not blind trust. He had, in many ways, nothing to base this on. They're surrounded, they're cut off. The sieges are there. Even though they left, they probably led a remnant of soldiers behind just to keep an eye on things. But there's a confidence there because he knew God and God knew him. This is what prayer is about, establishing that kind of relationship. If God were a physical person, you could talk to him in this way, couldn't you? You have friends like that probably. But God's not a person, and yet why should we have any different relationship with him? Tell him what's in your heart, what you're struggling with, what you're happy about, what you don't understand. Read a section of Scripture. I don't understand this. Let God bring that to you. Struggling at work. I don't know how to approach this person. Read the Proverbs. Ask God to direct you. It's amazing how he works these things out at times. Have you ever considered taking a note before God? This is what Hezekiah did. He took the letter before God. Do you do that with prayer lists? Items that are sent out of concern? Requests for prayers in different levels? And I'm not saying that we need to take a note before God on everything that we pray about. I'm saying that perhaps we should consider it, especially at critical times or times of great uncertainty. I've done that. I'll rehearse a couple of those things for you here in a moment. But Hezekiah knew God would take care of the matter. He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But he knew that he had no other option. I don't say that in that he wished he had other options. He realized this was completely in God's hands. And so he went to him. Let's go to James next. With all that in mind, let's look at a couple of verses in James. James 4, verse 2. James wrote this letter, if you go back to chapter 1, to the scattered tribes of Israel. Even after the Assyrians took them captive, Judah, Benjamin, the southern tribes, what became known as Judah, the nation of Judah, they knew where those tribes went because they didn't go very far. After the Assyrian Empire fell, they moved a little east. They became other peoples, primarily the Scythians, the Parthians. They were a great thorn in the side of the Romans, but they knew where they were. And so James is looking at what's going on internally in their nations, and they were not living right, even though they had still some knowledge of God's way of life. And so in chapter 4, verse 1, he says, "Where do wars and fights come from among you?" And if you look at the history of the Scythian and the Parthian empires, they fought internally as much, if not more, than they fought externally. They were always beating each other up. So verse 2, he says, "You lust and you do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, and yet you do not have because you do not ask." Verse 3, "When you do ask, you don't receive because you ask amiss that you may spend it on your pleasures." This is the right relationship I'm talking about. The priorities, Matthew 6:33. Are we asking for things to bring us closer to God and his kingdom? Or are we asking for things that may not be the best for us? Well, let's consider chapter 5, verse 16. James 5, verse 16. Confess your trespasses to one another. You can only do that with a friend. Because if you do it with somebody that's not your friend, they're going to use that against you probably, aren't they? At least to hurt you in some way. Confess your trespasses to one another. So if God is our friend, can we confess our shortcomings to him? Absolutely. He knows them anyway. But oftentimes, acknowledging where you fall short is the first step to doing something about it. Notice, pray for one another, that you may be healed. Now, we can look at this physically, and there's nothing wrong with that. None of us likes to be in pain, discomfort. None of us likes when our bodies don't function the way they're supposed to. But this is not just talking about physical healing. What's the more important healing that needs to take place? Between our ears, in our character. And then the ending of the verse, the effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Look at what happened in Judah because of Hezekiah having a righteous prayer that was possible through a friendship with God. The Greek word translated as prayer here means what we think it is, prayer, but the second meaning of the word, the second word in the verse, in verse 16, pray for one another, and then the other one, prayer of the righteous man. The second one there is the word deesis, and it means a petition. So it's not just praying, it's bringing something before God, much like Hezekiah did. And I think it's interesting that James uses both meanings of the word prayer here in this verse. Praying in the context of the first usage is just normal prayer, a yielding to God, a realignment, a recharging of our spiritual batteries, that approach that we should have before Him. Praying in the context of that second usage of the word is to plead a case before God, to make a request, to entreat Him for something or someone. If I read this to you in some other translations, I think that'll become evident. The Darby Bible has this verse this way: the fervent supplication of the righteous man has much power. Why does it have power? Because of the relationship with God. If someone on the street walked up to you and said, I need $50, would you give it to them? Maybe, maybe not. If you have a friend come to you and say, I need $50, if it's a good friend, you probably won't even ask why. The Douay-Rheims Bible says for this verse, the continual prayer of a just man avails much. The Weymouth New Testament has the heartfelt supplication of a righteous man exerts a mighty influence. I find all those very interesting. How do you view prayer? It's not just a list of things we need from God. It's talking and having a relationship, developing a deep friendship with God. There's a prayer among the ancient Jews that says this. This is the axiom. The prayers of a righteous are short. Because you don't need to say much. You're already friends, right? You know what they're thinking. You know where they're coming from. You know their heart. You know more about them. They don't have to say a whole lot. And it's amazing how many short prayers are in the Bible. The one with Hezekiah, how long would that be if we timed it out? Less than a minute. Why is that true? Well, as I said, true friends already have laid the foundation of understanding, so that in effective prayer, there is only the matter at hand. So I mentioned earlier about having a list going before God. I've done this several times in my life. It might seem odd to say it in this regard, but before I married Roxanne, I had a list. Here are the things I see as positives. Here are the things I see I'm not sure about. What should I do? Specifics regarding the twins, not only the pregnancy, but in terms of blessings that came from them. Some of you are aware, I'll mention it here just in passing, we weren't able to have children for a long, long time. And so as that came ultimately to fruition, one of the things in my prayer was specifics. I won't go into all the specifics, but I went before God with those specifics. I find it very comforting that he answered almost every one of those. My ordination to an elder. That's a very serious and sobering responsibility to take on, and not one that I was going to take lightly. But I went to God with a list. Good things I see coming out of this, not so good things I see coming out of this, potentially. I've had more than one job thing come up over the years that I didn't know what to do. How to face an adversarial boss, conflict over Sabbath, holy days, all kinds of various things, and jobs that ended up replacing them, whether they were good or not, and oftentimes it seemed like God didn't answer any one of those prayers. But after 25 years, I looked back on my career before I became a pastor and realized in hindsight that God answered every one of those prayers. I just didn't see it at first. Let's just a couple more verses. Let's go back to Matthew 26. We have, as many examples, Christ's prayers to the Father, to see how he thought, how he interacted with the Father, what was on his mind. And so not just Matthew 6, but read those other prayers at some point and see his approach to the Father. Matthew 26, there's another section of that. We're just going to read verse 39. He simply says here, he went a little further, fell on his face. This is the night before he's crucified, saying, "Oh, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." Do we understand humanly why he would pray that? He knew what was coming. He was the one who gave the prophecies. He knew humanly what that meant, the pain that he was going to go through, the agony, the hours and hours and hours this would drag out. Nobody signs up for that willingly. That's his prayer. But yet, look how he tempers it. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. We can ask God. I've gone to God many times and saying, here's what I think, but please don't do anything that's not your will. We can ask until God says no, because James 1:6 tells us to ask not wavering. But have that relationship. Have that friendship with God. Whatever's on your mind, whatever you're dealing with, struggling with, concerned about. This is what prayer is about. I could give you a list of things to consider, and there's value in that, but I'm wanting to look at this in a more holistic view, a broader picture view. Let's conclude going back to 2 Kings and see what God's response was to Hezekiah. Because again, it looked pretty bleak. The armies were there. The Rabshakeh was not just blowing smoke. His threats were legitimate. Every nation had fallen under their hand to that point. What was Hezekiah going to do? He went to God and said, basically, I don't know what to do. It's you they're impugning, not us. And God had Isaiah tell them, don't worry about this. I'll take care of it. So what happened? 2 Kings 19 and in verse 20. Then Isaiah the son of Amos sent to Hezekiah, saying, Thus says the eternal God of Israel, because you have prayed to me against Sennacherib of Syria, I have heard. It's not that he prayed against the king of Assyria. It's that he prayed to God. He could have trusted in his own military, couldn't he? He could have thought that he could have pulled a rabbit out of a hat here somehow and that they would get out from underneath this. That's not what Hezekiah did. He went to God. It could be anything. Should I make this decision? Buy this house, buy this car? Should I go to this college or that college? Should I marry this person or not? You know, all these decisions we make through the course of life. And it's not that we can't make any decision, but do we want God's will in our life? That's what Christ said in John 10. Not my will, but yours. Isaiah says, okay, because you did this, verse 21, this is the word which the Eternal has spoken concerning him, the king of Assyria. The virgin, the daughter of Zion, has despised you, laughed at you to scorn. The daughter of Jerusalem has shaken her head behind your back. Whom have you reproached and blasphemed? The king of Assyria thought it was just a puny little nation of Judah. Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted up your eyes on high? He thought it was Hezekiah. He was just dictating to the people of his kingdom. He answers it. You've done these things against the Holy One of Israel. By your messengers you have reproached the Lord and said, by the multitude of my chariots I have come up to the height of the mountains, to the limits of Lebanon. I will cut down its tall cedars, and its choice cypress. I will enter the extremity of its borders. To fruitful forests I have dug and drunk strange water, and with the soles of my feet I have dried up the brooks of the defense. Did you not hear long ago how I made it? This is God talking to the king of Assyria. You've done all these things, but did you not hear how I made it from ancient times, that I formed it, that I have brought it to pass, that you should be for the crushing of fortified cities and the heap of ruins? I've allowed you to do what you've done as punishment to these nations, not because of your superiority. Therefore, their inhabitants had little power, because I gave you that job. They were dismayed and confounded. They were a grass of the field, and the green herb, and the grass of the housetops, a grain blighted before it's grown. But I know your dwelling place. You're going out, and you're coming in. Your rage against me. See, this was not just an instrument of God doing his will. They took pleasure in this. Because your rage against me and your tumult have come up to my ears, therefore I will put a hook in your nose and my bridle in your lips. And if you look at some of the ancient friezes as they glorified these nations that they took in captivity, it was not uncommon that they led them away. They would literally put a ring in their nose and tie them together and lead them back to their land. This is the imagery. The king of Assyria knew exactly what God was talking about here. I will turn you back by the way which you came. This shall be the sign to you. You shall eat this year such as grows of itself, and in the second year what springs up from the same. In the third year sow and reap, plant vineyards, eat the fruit of them. The remnant who have escaped the house of Judah shall again take root downwards. In other words, this is my proof. You're not going to take Judah. They're going to go on and live their lives. Verse 31, for out of Jerusalem shall go a remnant. Those who escape from Mount Zion, the zeal of the Eternal host will do this. Therefore thus says the Eternal concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come to this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with a shield, or build a siege mound against it. By the way that he came, the same he shall return, and he shall not come into this city, says the Eternal. This is now Isaiah speaking to Hezekiah. Here's what's going to happen. He's going to go home. For I will defend this city. Who's I? God. I will. Because of the relationship, God says, don't worry, Hezekiah. I've got this. I'll take care of it for you. Do you go before God in prayer with that confidence? When you have that kind of friendship, relationship with God, to know that he will take care of it. Whatever it is, however it gets done, whenever it gets done. I will defend this city to save it for my own name's sake and for my servant David's sake. So here's the conclusion. Verse 35, it came to pass on a certain night, the angel of the Eternal went out and killed the camp of the Syrians, 185,000. Judah didn't have to lift a finger, didn't have to draw a sword, didn't have to mount anyone on a horse to go out. In the night, God sent the angel through. 185,000 people died in that camp. I like this next part. I find it humorous. When the people arose in the morning, there were corpses, all dead. I don't know how you have corpses otherwise. I guess just to reinforce the point. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed. I would think so, after losing 185,000 soldiers. That's a pretty heavy blow. He returned home and remained at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshiping in the temple of Nisroch, his god, that his sons, Adremelech and Sharezer, struck him down with the sword. They escaped in the land of Ararat, and Ezra Haddon, his son, reigned in his place. God certainly took care of it, didn't he? What did Hezekiah have to do to fix any of that? Not one thing. But it's all predicated on the relationship, wasn't it? The friendship he had with God. What could you ask God for that he would take care of that you haven't asked him for yet? Strength in his word, to call to mind what we hear on these days, the holy days, what you read in your study, what he has planted in your mind. What could he do as the end time approaches for you to be an instrument in his hand? What could he give you in your life, physical as it is now, to help you to that end? This is what prayer is about. You and I are called the friends of God. And as friends, we have a unique relationship with him. A relationship the world doesn't begin to have, let alone understand. We can come before God, as Hezekiah did. We can come before God anytime we need him, and we can list, if you will, these various things that we need help with, that we have a desire to know God's will on, to understand what he would have us do, to simply ask him. We can go before him with our prayers, with our petitions, in righteousness. And in doing so, exert a mighty influence. This is prayer. This is the relationship. What kind of friendship do you have with God?